Hello and a very warm welcome to the WWF Ask an Expert webinar on climate change. This is part of the Climate Action Project 2020, and WWF is delighted to be supporting CAP this year. It's a really fantastic opportunity to connect students and teachers the world over to talk about the biggest issue of our time. This webinar is a chance to ask anything that's burning away at your subconscious around climate change. However, I know that a lot of you will have been looking at the causes and the effects of climate change for several weeks as part of the Climate Action Project. So we're going to kind of skip over the basics in this webinar, and we've got an incredible panel of speakers, experts from many fields. And this is a chance for those experts to introduce a particular facet, something that they are an expert in, to show the complexity of the issues around climate change and to hopefully give you a new way of looking at it and some new thinking about the actions we can take and about the solutions to the problems we face. And understanding climate change and the potential for solutions is absolutely key. One idea or one leader can change the world. And that idea or that leader could be you in the future. So although climate change is daunting and the scale of change needed and the speed at which we need that change to happen is a little bit frightening, it's really important to remember that it is possible, and it's by expanding our minds and by understanding these complex issues, as we will be able to do through this webinar and through the Climate Action Project, that we can find a really positive future ahead. So without further ado, I'll just talk you through who we've got speaking today. I'm Matt Larson-Dorr. I'm the Education Manager at WWF UK. We have Ray Durrani, who is Head of Sustainable Finance, Stuart Dainton, Trees and Woods Expert, Caroline Koch, Polar Specialist, and Simon Walmsley, Oceans Chief Advisor. And I'll leave it up to them to explain why their areas of expertise are so important in this conversation around climate change. Each speaker is only going to give a very short introduction to their area of expertise, and then we're going to leave plenty of time at the end for questions and to dive into some of the issues that you are considering. Okay, over to you, Caro.
Hello, everybody. Amazing to see so many people joining. It's really exciting. So my name is Caro. I work at the WWF as a polar specialist. So I look after our conservation programs in the Arctic, so the home of polar bears. You see a picture on the slide of the cuddly polar bears, and Antarctica, so where the penguins live. So I've always been really, really passionate about protecting the world. I became a vegetarian when I was 11 years old, and then started off studying geography, and I spent 1 year in Iceland, and I got really excited about everything polar. So I did later a PhD in polar research. And actually behind me, you see a picture of a coastline in the Canadian Arctic, and we were measuring how this coastline was retreating, and we would come back every other day. And every time we came back, we saw it changing, and we saw climate change basically happening on a day-to-day basis. And that experience really inspired me to join WWF and to take action on climate change, because it felt I was just describing the problem, but I really wanted to work on solutions. So that's what I'm here today to speak about, the importance of the polar regions. So I have 3 key points about the polar regions. They are incredibly important. They work as thermostat of our planet. So I saw that a lot of you joined from really warm countries like India, and you can imagine like the thermostat or like an aircon in a big building, and imagine if this aircon was failing. That means everything is just heating up more and more. And this is the role the polar regions play in the world. They are really helping to stabilize our climate, but they are heating up 2 to 3 times faster than the rest of the world. So in the top right corner, you can see a map of temperature change in 2018 compared to the long-term average. And you see especially the north and the south, so north where the Arctic is and south where Antarctica is, are heating up much faster than the rest of the world. And that brings me to my second point. What happens in the polar regions doesn't stay there. And you might already experience some of these examples. So they control global circulation patterns and also extreme, like they are linked to extreme weather events. So the more heat, the more the planet is heating, the more extreme weather we'll experience. So heat waves, droughts, more intense rainfall, stronger hurricanes, because warmer air can hold more moisture. So they are really, really important. And then also the land ice is melting from glaciers and ice sheets, and like coming into the ocean and causing sea levels to rise. So that's another direct effect that we can feel all across the world, rising seas. But the solution, and this brings me to my third point, the solutions don't lie in the polar regions. Like we really need to, as industrialized countries, take action on climate change and cut greenhouse gas emissions drastically and stop this from happening, because what will happen in the polar regions really depends on the decisions we take today. So that's my brief summary. And I'm going to hand over to Stuart, because polar regions are not the only important biome in the world.
Well, thank you very much, Caro. And I was really delighted to see everybody on the webinar today, and I'm so delighted to be able to talk to you about trees and woods. And so my name is Stuart Dainton. I'm really delighted to talk to you about the critical importance of how our trees and our forests around the globe can help us in tackling climate change. I work in WWF on a forest program, but I've not always been working in forestry and around woods and trees. I used to be in the Royal Air Force, but it was really fortunate through my travel over 20 years ago in my previous role, where I saw the real wonder of trees and seeing the very best and perhaps some of the worst things that we've been doing to our planet with our trees and forests. The real wonder in areas such as the amazing redwoods in California, through to the jungles in Central America, through to, unfortunately, some of the destruction that we've had with deforestation around the globe, and how we've managed to change land use for farming, maybe produce beef or to produce palm oil, and creating huge plantations. It's really changed the landscape. And so really ending deforestation is so key. And it was that really gave me the passion to think about a career change and to get involved in trees and woods. And I've been probably in forestry for the last 12 years or so. And I'm just going to talk about 3 key areas that I think is so important for why trees and woods are critical in the fight against climate change. But it's not only in the fight against climate change, but trees and woods provide so many other benefits. There's rich biodiversity in our forests. And probably over 50% of the world's biodiversity lives in our forests. And that's about the richness of plants and animals. And actually, it's the linkage of how our forests support our soils and our water systems, and how they regulate local climates. And those on a larger scale can have impact on our global climate. And for large areas such as the Amazon, that can really help drive global climate systems. So it's critically important that we maintain our forests. Stopping the loss of forest is really important, but we've also then got to put something back. We've probably lost over the last 50 years or so, 40% of our forests. And we're going to have to embark on a massive restoration program to put forests back into the landscape. And perhaps one of the big reasons for this is because it's also related to our health and our well-being. Trees and woods are intrinsically linked to our health and our well-being. We know when we get outside, if we're walking around in woods or trees or forests, we feel better. And the science is showing why that is the case. It helps our immune systems, it helps us de-stress, but it also is intrinsically linked to the well-being of our planet, as I was just mentioning about how the critical importance on driving water systems. And these things are all linked into the third point I want to raise, about the livelihoods for people. Because in changing climate, that will impact on many, many aspects of things, whether it be the homes for wildlife, but indeed home for people. Over 1 billion people live and work around our forests. And our forests provide sustainable resources. They provide jobs and food and medicines and a whole range of opportunities. So ensuring our forests remain standing is so critical in terms of the fight against climate change. So we desperately need to protect and restore our forests for people, for nature, and for climate. But as Cara was saying, it's not only about the polar reasons, and it's not only about trees and woods. So I'm going to hand over to Ray now to talk about the next area.
Hi, everyone. Thanks for joining. Hopefully you can hear me okay. I'm Ray Dirani, and I head our sustainable finance team. It's great to see so many people from all over the world, many from India, where my family originates, from Gujarat. I was born in Canada and lived in the US, but originally from Gujarat. So nice to see so many people from everywhere, including India. So what does money have to do with climate? Well, actually, it has a lot to do with the climate system. And I'm just going to talk for a few minutes on a few points related to that. So why does money matter for climate change and the environment? Well, all business activity needs money to function. And when we put our money in a bank, that money doesn't just sit there. That money gets lent, it gets given to companies to do things all around the world, whether it be things that are destroying the environment or things that are in fact improving it. So often if we follow the money, we can follow the chain of influence and be able to influence companies and also change the direction of money to more sustainable sources. So what is the importance of our economic and financial system? Well, this is a massive system that humans have created, and it's global in nature. Unfortunately, it has not put environment and climate and people at its center. In addition, our economic and financial system doesn't really recognize the 1.5 degrees of climate change that we need to stay below, and the one planet condition that we live in. These are scientific imperatives, and it's really important that we help to redesign our economic and financial system to take account of this, because this will affect all of our banks and our global capital flow all around the world. And we can do this because our economic and financial system was designed by people, and there's no reason why we can't reorient and change it. In that vein, we made a movie recently to help tell the story to the industry, but also to the average person. The movie is called Our Planet Too Big to Fail. I think a link will be posted in the chat. And we've had an amazing reception since we launched the film a few weeks ago at a global virtual launch. We made it with Silverback Films, and it's really about instructing why the finance sector is important in the fight against climate change and environmental preservation. We have stunning visuals in the film and interviewees from around the world from key sectors in finance. And it details how banks and investors can take action, what action they need to take in 5 key areas where they need to improve. And it's the sector that influences all other sectors. So it's really important that we change the finance sector for good. So part of what it also talks about is how banks can change their policies and which companies should in fact get capital in order to build a sustainable future. So I encourage all of you to watch the film and share it with your colleagues as well. So what can you do as an individual, a teacher, by using money? Well, there's actually a lot you can do. One is you can find out what your bank is doing with your money. It's in fact your money that's sitting in the bank or in an investment product. And if enough people start asking banks where they're lending their money to, what kind of companies, what policies do they have in place, what are they checking for, that can have a big difference in the market. And for teachers, I think it's quite important to figure out where your pension is invested. Most people that have a pension don't know that in fact this pension is invested in companies, and you're trying to save for, we're all trying to save for our future. Well, we don't want to undermine the future that we're ultimately saving for. So we want to make sure that our hard-earned money is actually in companies that are helping to build a sustainable future, as opposed to companies that are destroying the climate system for other environmental areas as well. So just to end on the fact that actually the finance and economic system, how money works, is central to the question of our economic and financial system, and central to the question of climate change and environment. It's one of the big kind of macro global systems out there, and if we can change it and reorient it to take full account of nature and climate, we really have a chance to stick below 1.5 degrees. So we're quite excited about this area of work. It's really gaining traction in the UK and globally, and there's a lot you can do as individuals, teachers and students to help. And with that, I will pass to the next speaker, please.
Thank you, Ray, which is me. First an apology. I've actually got a very bad cold, so if I sneeze on the monitor, I apologise in advance. My name's Simon Walmsley. I'm the Chief Marine Advisor here at WWF UK. Well, what do I do on a daily basis? Well, basically, I provide science support for all the marine work that WWF UK undertakes. And that involves on a day-to-day basis developing research which answers some of those questions, some of those really big questions, or tries to answer some of those big questions that need to be answered in order to gain transformational change. So each one of the speakers has mentioned transformational change. We need the research behind that to answer those questions. One of the pieces of work I'm doing at the moment is on blue carbon. And as you can imagine, blue carbon is the carbon that's contained in the marine environment. And we still don't know enough about the blue carbon. We don't know how it's emitted, how it's absorbed, stored. So we're doing lots of research on how those mechanisms work in order to protect those areas that are carbon rich effectively. So why am I so passionate about the marine environment? Well, it's 71% of the planet. The Earth's ocean covers 71% of the planet. We are a blue planet, and it's just totally fascinating to me. I've always been fascinated by it, and obviously what's in the ocean. I think it's really the unknowns of the ocean that really attract me. We really do know more about the surface of the moon than the deep oceans, which is a great quote, but totally true. I'm also an angler and a surfer, and I've done those things for many years, and I've always been associated with the ocean from a very young age, as has my family. My grandfather was an Arctic hero, Arctic convoy hero, and a Navy diver. And when I was very young, I used to sit on his knee and he used to tell me lots and lots of stories about the ocean. And this just really inspired me to see what he had seen, but also to ensure that future generations could also have that privilege as well, because things are changing so much. So what am I going to present to you today? Well, it says it there on the screen. It's the ocean, climate victim, climate hero. So what does the victim state look like at the moment? Well, the ocean's absorbing excess heat, excess carbon dioxide, and it's overloaded from the atmosphere. It's becoming warmer, more acidic, and the salinity is changing. And the oxygen loss in particular is a huge problem, which I'll outline a little bit later. But all of this is fundamentally changing ecosystems and actually the climate system on Earth, because the ocean is so important. It covers 71% of the planet. So what does this look like in reality? Well, I think Caro talked about sea level rise. We are actually losing low-lying islands already. And a little known problem that we do have is something called saline ingress. That's the salt water moving inland from the sea level rise. So that moves into drinking water, and it also moves into agricultural areas, and it's already affecting things like rice paddies. There's also an increase in acidity, which is a huge problem for organisms that form shells that are made of calcium in particular. And then the whole of this is affecting ocean chemistry and the ability of the oceans to actually buffer the changes that we're causing on the planet. In terms of salinity is an issue because it's different wherever you are around the planet. So in the polar seas that Caro was talking about, those ocean areas are becoming more fresh because of the ice melt. If you look in enclosed seas like the Mediterranean, for instance, those areas are becoming more saline, more salty because of higher evaporation, because of higher temperatures. And as I mentioned before, the oceans are losing oxygen. They've lost 2% since 1960. Now, this doesn't seem so much, but if you think about humans' reliance on oxygen, and then also think that it's more difficult to extract oxygen from water, then you can see that this is a huge problem. And then in terms of temperature increases, I think we're all very, very familiar with the pictures of the Great Barrier Reef and other major reefs with the bleaching incidents. And if we actually carry on the way we are, we're set to lose all our corals, or the majority of them, by 2050, which would be a massive loss, not just for biodiversity, but for the planet, for people. But there are other issues around temperature, which we're discovering now. These issues of marine heat waves, which are huge areas up to thousands of kilometers of increased temperatures that have massive impacts on the ocean. They cause fish kills, shellfish kills, and these are increasing. The numbers are increasing, and also their intensity is increasing. They cause alien species to be in areas where they shouldn't be, and harmful algal blooms, and massive disturbances on the ecosystem. So what does the ocean look like in terms of its hero status? Well, you can see the words up there. The ocean, actually, if it wasn't for the ocean, the planet would be 35 degrees hotter. So, you know, we're talking about a couple of degrees at the moment, and how the impacts of those would have an effect on the planet. But if it wasn't for the oceans, 35 degrees, and a quarter of the extra greenhouse gases emitted that we put into the atmosphere have been captured by the oceans instead of warming the planet. So again, hugely important. The issue is that the oceans are losing their ability to perform these functions. So the planet might even warm quicker than we think. And this again just is highlighting the importance of the oceans. So what do we do to restore the hero status of the oceans? Well, Cairo mentioned it. The first thing we need to do is deep and rapid cuts in greenhouse gas emissions. We really need to wean ourselves off the reliance on fossil fuels, reliance on oil, gas. And secondly, by restoring the diversity, productivity and resilience of ocean ecosystems, this is one of the most powerful ways we can combat the devastating effects of climate change. And Stuart also mentioned this with forests. At the same time, we can also have a healthy ocean that benefits people and nature. I think the message here is to let the oceans, enable the oceans to do what they've always done. The natural cycles, the growth, it's not just the natural cycles of the oceans itself, but also the natural cycles of the organisms, the species there. So they grow, they breed, they poo, and this all helps to lock carbon into the system. So we must help the oceans in terms of what we're doing in the oceans, for example, fisheries, so that we don't put more and more pressure on the oceans. We must allow them to undergo their natural cycle and do what they've always been doing, and this will help the greenhouse gas issues. On that note, I will stop. Thank you very much.
A huge thank you to all of our speakers for some really interesting content, and also for being so brief to leave us with a good half an hour for questions. We've got loads of really interesting questions. Thank you for those. And I've also had some in advance. So what I'd like to do is to go around first of all and pose a question to each of our speakers that has come in. And then there'll be some questions that I'll invite all the panelists to answer. I'm going to stop sharing so we can see faces of our experts. So to go back to you first of all, Caro, I'm going to combine a couple of questions, if that's all right. So the first one is, you had polar bears and penguins on your slide, and everyone's heard of those kind of iconic species. What other species living in the poles are facing extinction? And if I can tag on to that, another question that's a bit further down, which is, what are WWF doing to protect particularly polar bears, the question asks about, but also any of the other biodiversity of the poles?
Yeah, excellent questions. And I'm glad I get to talk not only about polar bears and penguins, but also the other fascinating wildlife. So I start with Antarctica. So in Antarctica, you have Antarctic krill. So this is one of the most important species in Antarctica, actually, because it's the foundation of the food web. So it's this little tiny crustaceous. If you Google, Matt has it as a background, you might be able to see it. So they swim in swarms, and penguins are feeding on them, and so are whales. So you have a lot of whales that are migrating thousands and thousands of kilometers to feed in the Southern Ocean on this really nutritious and delicious krill. So yeah, seals as well, different types of seals, whales, the penguins. And something we do in Antarctica is to really work to designate marine protected areas. So we are funding a lot of research into krill and into penguins as well, and into the different predators that feed on krill, to understand how climate change is affecting them and which areas become more and more important in the future. So we want to make sure that we not only protect the areas that are important for these species today, but also the ones that are important in the future, because the polar regions are continuing to change. And yeah, the other big part, and that applies to both polar regions, are working to address climate change and to cut greenhouse gas emissions. So we're working with governments to really hold them to their commitments that they set in the Paris Agreement in 2015. Like, countries came together to agree to keep warming to well below 2 degrees, and with efforts being taken to limit it to 1.5 degrees of warming compared to pre-industrial levels. So this is also something that will have a direct effect on the species in the polar regions. And moving back to the Arctic, because the species that are in the Arctic are not necessarily found in Antarctica. So yeah, you have the polar bear, and then yeah, walrus are quite well spread around. Also, you have species living on land, so caribou, or they are called reindeer in other regions. They are affected by climate change. It doesn't mean that all of these species are facing extinction. So, for example, polar bears are classified as vulnerable on the IUCN Red List of threatened species. So, so yeah, but they might, of course, face extinction if we don't take rapid action on climate change. And as for polar bears, also a lot of marine organisms, seals, whales. It's a really rich biodiversity, and it's really interesting because the food web is not so complex like in the tropics. So it's really important protecting those, and the food web might not be as resilient to climate change, and species might not be able to adapt. So also there we're working to address climate change because it's the single biggest threat, and then also working to implement marine protected areas for important habitats. And I put in the Q&A chat like another link that talks more about polar bears in more detail and about the different work that we are doing to help them. Great question. Thank you.
That's great. Thank you, Caro. And I'm delighted that krill got a mention there. As the question suggested, we have these iconic species that everyone loves to have on their Christmas cards and posters, polar bears and penguins, but krill are the heroes of our planet, and they rely on a healthy polar ecosystem for their breeding, but then of course they go around the world and fuel the ecosystems that Simon was talking about in the oceans. So without them, we really do have a problem. Okay, so Stuart, there's a couple of questions on your area of expertise, so I'm going to combine them as I did with Caro's. So the first of all is, do you think that planting trees is enough to save our planet in terms of addressing carbon in the atmosphere, or do we need to look for technology as well? And then alongside that, there's a question, if trees can be the answer, how many trees do we have to plant?
Yes, no, they're fantastic questions, and I think the first question is really of critical importance, because actually trees alone won't solve the problem. Actually, the biggest thing that we've really got to be looking at is how do we reduce our carbon footprint? How do we look at the amount of carbon that we're emitting, and how can we change that? How can we change the balance from fossil fuels and the use of fossil fuels and the way that we emit carbon through all of our lives? And how do we change the systems that we currently have, even our food systems, and linking it with sort of actually ensuring that we don't have further deforestation, clearing land to make sure that we can produce more food, because it's thought that we already have enough available land around the globe to produce enough food for the number of people that are on the planet. So we don't need to be clearing more land. So trees are a really important part of the solution, but it is absolutely got to be reducing our carbon footprint first and foremost. In terms of the natural solution, trees are probably thought to be able to deal with about 1/3 of being the solution for addressing climate change. So critically, we've got to ensure that we protect our existing forests to ensure that the carbon that's stored in those forests can be retained in there rather than emitting carbon, but also by increasing the number of trees across the globe. And that goes really to the second question that you had, is, you know, how many trees do we really need to be looking at? Well, it's estimated that we probably need to plant an area of restoring forests and planting new areas of forest around 1.8 billion hectares of land. And I've been working on a project with 1 trillion trees, and it's estimated that around about 1 trillion trees or so are going to have to be required in terms of looking at the future balance of ensuring that we have the right number of trees on the globe. We currently have around about 3 trillion trees on the planet, and we desperately need more tree cover.
Brilliant, thank you, Stuart. Okay, before I pass over a question to Ray, there's a question sort of generally about what is meant by resilience. I think a couple of the speakers mentioned it. I've typed an answer there, but I thought it was worth just saying to everyone on the call what we mean when we talk about resilience. The resilience is the ability of a biome or a species to recover from a challenge or some damage, and to cope with change. And the bigger a landscape of a biome is, and the more biodiversity there is, so the more life and different kinds of life there is, the more it is able to cope with damage, to absorb that challenge, and still bounce back, and the more it is able to adapt to change. So if you think about having lots of different kinds of animals and plants, able to thrive in different conditions, if the conditions change, you're more likely to have some that can cope with that and can continue even if some have problems. Okay, so a really good question here from Anna for you, Ray. So finance, you've talked about the importance of money and the finance system. Is there greenwashing in finance too? If we're being told that there's a good product or a good thing that we should be doing with our money, how dangerous is it that that's actually not the case? What do we need to look for and be aware of?
Yeah, that's a good question, as are many of the questions here. We do need to be careful. There is greenwash in the financial markets. Like with any product, people are kind of rushing to feel a growing demand for really sustainable products. So I've seen things that are labeled sustainable that are actually sustainable, and then often some are not. So it's really about like in a car, you want to open the hood and actually look inside, see what's there, rather than just relying on label. We are working to hopefully make the labels more consistent and reliable. But at this point, you do have to do a bit of homework. It's not rocket science. If you're looking at a fund, it's about what companies the fund holds, for instance, and often they publish their top 10 holdings, and that's a good place to start. So, I think you do have to kind of question it a little bit, and hopefully we'll get to the stage where they can be a very good trusted label. But at the moment, yes, you do have to do a bit of homework, and certainly ask if you don't know and you don't feel confident. You can ask to get the to know what questions to ask, or get in touch with us as well.
Great, thank you, Ray. Okay, so Simon, so coming back to the oceans, a couple of questions again that I'm going to combine, if that's all right. So we mentioned obviously that ocean life is important to it playing that important role in stopping the planet from warming and absorbing carbon. So you mentioned coral reefs and the fact that they are at risk as a result of these changes. How do coral reefs positively contribute? What's their importance? And then also, if you could also answer to global warming. The question says how many, but just a sense of the scale of risk to sea-dwelling animals.
Thank you, everybody. Very good questions. Yeah, corals are incredibly important for a number of reasons. I think they cover 0.15% of the ocean seabed, but yet they're responsible for up to 25% of the biodiversity found in the oceans. So just on that sort of figure, you can see the importance of coral reefs. They also stop flooding and wave inundation. So incredibly important. And they're also obviously an area and a habitat that's very useful for people, and they're good for economics, tourism, fisheries if done in the right way. And also when we look at the oceans, we look at seascapes. So we don't always look at one habitat at a time, and we also look at how those habitats link. So corals innately link with species and habitats like seagrass, which are also incredibly important for fish nurseries. And if you destroy a coral area, then that will impact further towards land on seagrass beds. And we can see from the bleaching incidents, it's a huge problem, because the biodiversity leaves, the corals die, there's no economic benefit, and there's no other benefits. It's just a lump of calcium in the end if it's not a living being. In terms of, I think the question was around the numbers of species, Matt, that are affected by climate change. Yeah, well, yeah, difficult question, because Stuart mentioned that 50% of the biodiversity is in forests. Well, if you talk to marine people, it's been postulated that up to 25 million species haven't been discovered in the oceans. So if you look at that in terms of biodiversity, it would be a huge amount. So we know little, and we need to know more about the numbers of species and the types of species. But what I would say is that every species is being affected by climate change. Even those species that are habitating the seabed 6 kilometers down are being affected by climate change. I'll give you some examples of fish. Fish are actually moving. They're moving to different parts of the world. We actually have a species around the UK called mackerel, and that's kind of on my watch, and that's now moving up to where Caro would be working in Greenland, and the locals in Greenland are fishing mackerel, and they don't even have a name for that mackerel. So they kind of don't know how to deal with it, and it is really an alien species, and we don't know how that will impact the ecosystem there in the end, but then they're making economic benefit from it. So all these questions are interlinked, and if you affect one part of the ocean, then it affects other parts of the ocean. So as Cara said in her presentation, you know, what happens in the Arctic and the Antarctic doesn't stay there. Well, what happens in the oceans doesn't stay in the oceans, because it also affects the climate as well. So it's a hugely big picture. And if you affect one part of the food chain, if you take out top predators or they move, then that has massive impacts on what else happens in the lower part of the food chain. Thank you.
That's great. Thank you, Simon. So we've still got 15 minutes of questions. I'll warn you now, we probably won't get through all of them. There are so many amazing questions here. I'm just going to go back to some questions that were sent in advance that I'd like all of the panel to think about whether they'd like to respond to. So I'll just pose it once, and then I'll go back round through the panelists in the same order as before, if that's all right, just to see if you have any thoughts on these. So these are from pupils from the 4th Gymnasium Privatas. Some really good questions in this list. I'm going to pick out 2. The first is, are there any advantages to climate change? So this would be an interesting one to look at from both the perspective of nature, wildlife, and also humans. Are there any winners in this change? And then alongside that, I'd be really interested to hear from the panel if they can just imagine what the world is going to be like in 30 years' time on the basis of the likely response that we can make in that time. So, Caro, if it's all right, I'll pass on to you. You've had the least time to think about it.
Can you repeat the second one, please? Where will we be in 30 years' time?
Yeah, how do you imagine the world being in 30 years' time? How will it be different?
Okay, thank you. Wow, those are some really good questions. So, yeah, I've been asked a lot about the advantages of climate change. So, for example, we're living in the UK, so the panelists and I. And some people might think, climate change will bring nicer weather, so it will be good for tourism. And I looked into research about that, and actually it doesn't outweigh the negative effects climate change will have, like especially in the UK and in Europe, it's more intense flooding. We have more deaths because of heat waves, and also stronger storms. So there might be some benefits, but they are not outweighing the negative impacts. And speaking for the polar region, so in the Arctic with the loss of sea ice, so you might have seen the news that it's the latest that sea ice has ever refrozen towards the winter. So it's October now, and by now the sea ice would already have refrozen for the winter, and it's still not the case. So this is really worrying. But less sea ice in the Arctic means opening up of shipping routes. So ships might be able to pass through, and this would mean a reduction in shipping time if you want to, cross the world and ship products across the world. So I guess economically, you could say this could be an advantage for shipping companies. But then, of course, there are big disadvantages for the species that live there. And like this big Arctic Ocean had been like a quiet place and like a sanctuary for so many species for so many years. So increase of shipping will also increase the noise, and that has impacts on the species. So I suppose my answer would be, it depends from what perspective you're looking at. But generally looking at the entire world, climate change is really, really expensive, and it increases the risk of health, of even pandemics, like biodiversity loss is linked to that. So I don't think it would outweigh, outweigh the benefits. And in 30 years' time, I'll be almost 60 years old. I think it really, really depends on the decisions that are taken today, this year, in the next 5 years, because it's really critical to what path we're going there. And I must say, always when I'm joining these webinars and I see so many people being so passionate about changing the world and about taking action and coming from so many places across the world, I'm really positive that we can really do it. So I think I want to go with the best case scenario, that the world comes together and on climate change and limits warming to 1.5 degrees, which means in 30 years for the polar regions, we will still see a lot of changes. So even if we stop the warming and any more greenhouse gases today, the poles would still continue to change over centuries and years to come, and sea levels would still continue to rise. But we would be able to secure a lot of really important habitats for polar bears, for whales, and help them adapt to it. So there would be a stabilization in that. So that's what I will go for. And now I'm passing on. Looking forward to the next answers.
Thanks, Caro. So yeah, Stuart, do you have any thoughts on those two questions?
Yes, they are super questions, and I think perhaps that with the first one about the advantages of climate change, I think it's always important to remember that climate has changed throughout history. You know, it has had many different fluctuations through time. Perhaps one of the biggest challenges at the moment, though, is the human impact that we're having on the pace of change. And the ability of the natural environment to then adapt to that change, to be able to accommodate things so that the balance can be kept. So I'd very much agree with Caro that actually, whereby there may be some very small localized benefits for some areas in some places, etc. Maybe it might be a little bit warmer or some places, but actually on the whole, the impacts are going to be so grave and so great that actually our systems just won't be able to adapt fast enough, because the natural environment changes through time, and it has adapted through time, and it's done that with nature. And nature's been in balance for a great period of time, and has worked very successfully. When you start to impose changes on it that become something that it can't cope with, those systems start to break down. And that is the big danger of it. So, personally, I can't really see any advantages with climate change. I think there would only be negative aspects. And so we really do have to address them. And I think that brings me on to the second question, which is where we might be in 30 years' time. I'm very much an optimist. I'm very much support what Cara said as well. I think we've got to really go with a sense of hope. Certainly in my lifetime, there has been extraordinary change across the globe in how we've had an impact on it. But I believe that because of technology and the way that we can communicate now, we're understanding that. We're understanding the changes that we've made. You know, Simon made a great point about actually, well, we just don't know so much about the oceans. We still don't know an awful lot about the forest. And we've got to learn so much. I mean, when we're talking about how much we know and how much biodiversity there is, that's only because that's what we know today. You know, it could be completely different as we learn more. And so I think in 30 years' time, we've got to try to ensure that the systems that we have today in terms of the nature that's around us, we've got to try to protect it. But I think because of communications, we're going to be able to ensure that we can tell the message around and people will want to act. And you can already see that building movement of people understanding the problem and wanting to do something about it. So I'm very optimistic that we will be able to make the changes. We've made changes over the last sort of 30, 40 years that has caused the destruction. I'm absolutely convinced over the next sort of 30 years, we'll be able to put that back. We'll be able to put elements back that will really help us support a planet that really does work for people, for nature and for our climate. So I remain very much the optimist.
Thank you, Stuart. Nice to hear. Okay, on to you, Ray.
Thanks. Difficult questions. I think I agree with the panelists so far, and I'd like to think of it as an analogy on the first question. I mean, it's kind of a crude analogy, but if you think of, let's say you have a box, you know, a big box this size, and inside the box you've got polar bears and krill and the UK and India and, you know, everything, you know, on the planet, and these pieces are moving around, and you know, some are gaining a bit of strength and some are losing, but the whole box is moving, let's say, towards the bedroom window, you know, with the window open, and the whole thing. So within the box, there's some changes, but the entire box is moving. And once we get towards that open window, you know, the whole box falls down to wherever is below. And I think that's the problem, is that climate change is will make us, and already, you know, if you listen to Johan Rockström from the Stockholm Resilience Center, he said that over the last 10,000 years, we've had plus or minus 1 degree of stability, and we're already almost through that stable period. So the problem with climate change is we risk going through irreversible tipping points into a new normal that all of us would like to avoid. We really don't know what's going to happen, right? In terms of sea level rise, oceans, you know, the warming potential, feedback loops. I mean, we're just entering really dangerous territory on a global level. And so I don't think it's fair to look at the individual components moving. You know, it's the bigger picture that's headed toward disaster. So that's how I kind of see it in my head, and therefore, you know, I don't think it's worth debating the winners and losers, because the entire system is at risk. So the second question, where are we going to be in 30 years? Well, these 10 years, this decade of sort of delivery is really important to shape that. So the decisions we take this decade, which, you know, the first year is almost over, you know, will affect how we're going to look in 2050. So it's difficult to answer. Obviously, if we don't take the right decisions, make drastic cuts in emissions, change how we live and behave, you know, change our wider systems, then we will see climate change breach through the levels that is safe. We will go through tipping points. We will see mass migration. We'll see the chances of pandemics and things going up. I mean, it's just, you know, fairly catastrophic. Obviously, we have the science now to help us try to avoid that, but we don't have much time. And I think the drastic action that needs to happen and is already starting in some areas, we need to really accelerate, and we can do it. And if we do that, we'll have a chance at a stable future. So I also side on the face of optimism, and I think this is the decade to do it, and do it sort of in line with the science and on a global basis.
Thank you, Ray. And Simon, any thoughts for you on those questions?
Thanks, Matt. And yeah, very good answers, everybody. Difficult to go last because you've taken all my ideas. I'll give it a go. So I think On the winners side, you heard my list of impacts in the ocean. What you've also got to consider is the links between those impacts and the cumulative nature of those impacts. And then Stuart mentioned that for his biome. So it's about the system, and Ray also mentioned the system, and I think Carol also mentioned this. It's about the system. So the system is going to be less predictable. So you're not going to be able to predict the risks so much. So the planet is going to be a loser if we carry on the way we are. And that's the way I'm looking at it. I did mention some potential regional winners, but then you have to look at what winning actually means. So you have fish moving to the northern and southern latitudes where the water's cooler, but then the people that need those primary sources of protein near the equator, developing countries, etc., will lose those fish. So how do we cope with that as a planet? So all this is really, really interlinked. And of course, I mentioned the mackerel moving up to Greenland. No one knows the impacts of those kind of species on the ecosystem generally, whether they'll take something out of the food chain that they shouldn't, and have something called a trophic cascade, which will impact the whole ecosystem. So huge questions, basically. And I would err on the side of precaution and say, as everyone else has, there'll be no big winners for sure. In terms of the 30-year question, that's an interesting one. I'll be well into my 80s, so quite a daunting one for me, actually. What I see, and what I consider myself, I suppose, is a realistic optimist, and I see what I would call an adapted world, and hopefully the adaptation will be on the positive side, depending on what scenario happens. If we carry on the way we are, then the adaptation will be all around sucking the carbon out of the atmosphere, keeping it in the ground, keeping it under the ocean. If we do it correctly, then we'll have more renewables. We'll be looking at these things called nature-based solutions, which in all our biomes, in all our areas of work, we're looking at the growing of the right trees in the right place at the right time, so you can stimulate biodiversity. People can benefit from them. I'm taking some of Stuart's thunder here, but it's the same for the oceans. You restore or protect things like seagrass, salt marshes, mangroves, and you have this cumulative benefit of benefiting people because they can fish, storm protection, and these habitats really hold on to carbon, and they put them into the sediments, so they're stored there for many years, and they're also brilliant for biodiversity. So I think in my realistic scenario, if we rely on nature more and stimulate nature and take away those pressures from nature, from all these biomes we're talking about, then we will be in a better state, and hopefully that's the way the world will be adapted in 30 years.
Great, thank you to all the panelists. We've got time for just one last question to go around the panel again, and it's been asked in various ways, and it's how I'd like to finish anyway, which is what can we do about this? And that means not just what can we do as humanity, as society, but what can we do as individuals, young people, students, teachers, and schools. So we'll go around again through the panelists, and then we'll bring on the subject of what the world might look like in 30 years. We have a challenge out at the moment for students called the Future Visions Challenge. And what we're asking students to do is to do that, exactly what the panelists have just done. Imagine what the world could and should look like in the future. And I think what's really important about that thought process is that the future isn't just about us trying to stop the worst thing that can happen. It's about us creating a future that is positive. There are so many aspects of life that can be done in a different way, or are not related to climate change. There's so much to save and so much to enjoy. And the future that we create that is sustainable and that does not contribute to a spiraling climate can be a really positive one that's better, healthier and happier than the world today. So I think it's always really important to remember that positive future. So I'll pass over to Caro to just respond, and then to go around the panelists once more on one idea for what we can do as individuals.
So Yeah, that's a really complex one, and we could probably all talk about it for hours. So it is not only up to individuals, it's individuals, businesses, and governments. But I think one of the best thing as individuals that we can do is use our voice and speak about climate change, educate yourselves, educate others, speak to local shop owners, like about climate change, about waste reduction, just really speak about it, because we need a broad understanding of everybody, understanding climate change, understanding action needs to be taken. So any decisions that governments are making need to be like founded and supported by the wide society. Yeah, so use your voice as much as you can in any context. I'll pass over to Stuart.
Thank you, Caro. Stuart.
Sorry.
Yeah, great, thank you. And I think the biggest thing that we must all do is reduce our carbon footprint. But in my absolute sort of area, I would say it's about ensuring that we have the right trees in the right places. And how do we do that? So that's about ensuring that we end deforestation, and that's about maybe looking at what we eat and actually the food that we consume and where it comes from. So I think, and ultimately something that everybody can do is supporting, you know, the nature in their area. So it's about maybe putting something back into the area, planting a tree, making sure it's in the right place, but putting some nature back into the area that's around you, I think would be the biggest thing that I would say as well. But we must crucially reduce our carbon footprint.
Thanks, Stuart. Over to you, Ray.
I'll give a different answer, just to keep it varied. I think you know, really dream big about what you're passionate about in this area. I was reading this morning something around Steve Jobs and Apple, and you think obviously it wasn't just one individual, but you know, he played such a role in what's happened with Apple and how they've revolutionized music and computing and, you know, so many different areas. And there's no reason why an individual, any of you on this call, could not revolutionize the way, you know, our climate system is integrated into you know, within the scientific constraints. I mean, it's hard, but it definitely can be done. And don't kind of settle. You know, dream about the system you want, and then go out and help do it. And you don't need all the answers. You know, the answers are out there, but it's actually the questions at the moment that matter a lot more as well. So it's kind of, I'm not going to give you very practical, but it's more, yeah, don't be afraid to dream, because we need dreamers to then, you know, turn that into reality. But without that dream of how we can live sustainably together on a planet, on one planet, we're not going to get there in time.
Thank you. And finally, Simon, any last thoughts from you?
Yeah, very quickly. I would agree with Stuart. Put something back is my answer. And it's not just trees. We can plant mangroves. We can plant seagrass, and it's fun getting into the water. I suppose the personal one for me, which I can say is what I'm doing and what my family does, is we don't fly. We don't fly for holidays. We have a VW camper van, and we go around the UK. And I'm not asking everybody to do that, but as flying is probably one of our biggest footprint issues on a personal level, that's what I do to reduce my footprint. Thank you.
Great, thank you so much. And I've just posted something in the chat there, but just to say it out loud, individuals all have power because our voices come together and pressure governments and pressure businesses to make the big changes that we need. So don't feel that these things are so big and so out of our grasp that there's nothing useful we can do. We all contribute to this demand for change, and that's what's really going to drive the biggest changes that we need to see that have been mentioned by the panelists. But also, if you can come together as a school, your effect is magnified. Your voices are amplified because there are many of you speaking as one, and the school is something which the whole community is aware of. Lots of families are connected to, lots of businesses are connected to. So think what you can do as a school. You can bring people together to discuss changes that are outside the school, across the community and beyond. and you can act in a way that has real impact as a school. Changing your energy provider as a school has a much greater impact than changing your home energy provider, for example, and so on. So please do think about what you can do, and don't feel that it's a helpless situation at all. So huge thanks to all the panelists. They've been absolutely fantastic. We had so many more questions than we could get to, but as you can imagine, we've been really impressed by the caliber of those questions. Please do watch out for them. We also have an Ask the Experts page on our website, so if there's something that wasn't answered and you would like it to be sent to you, you can just submit that on wwf.org.uk's website. And in the meantime, yeah, I wish you all the very best in coming up with your own solutions and having your own discussions around these incredibly important issues. So thanks to all for joining.